Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Undercooled. We are very pleased to have another special guest for today's episode, and this particular guest is the very excellent Professor Aeriel Murphy-Leonard from The Ohio State University. So, Aeriel, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We always like to start with introductions when we bring in someone new. So if you could first just tell us a little bit about yourself, and especially how did you get into MSc, and what was your MSc education like coming into the system?
Yeah, so my path to material science, I think, is a little different than most people that I've met, especially, most people don't know what material science is until they get to a college campus. And that's like the complete opposite for me. When I was in high school, I really wanted to be a lawyer. My goal was to go to Stanford and be the next Condoleezza Rice. Like I want to be the Secretary of State. And I met a high school teacher that said, you're really good at science. Have you considered doing science fair? And I had really no idea what science fair was. I think my response was something like, you mean like the volcanoes, what you see on TV. And her response, like, actually, no, you can do college level research as a high school student. What I didn't know was that teacher, Dr. Virginia Velarde at Wetumpka High School. So I am from Alabama. I didn't say that. Um, she was the state coordinator for science fair. And so she put me in contact with a professor at the University of Alabama. And I actually started working in cyclic deformation of high strength alloys, aluminum alloys, when I was just a sophomore in high school. And I went on to compete in the ISEF, the International Science and Engineering Fair, twice. And when it was time to go to college, of course, I chose materials engineering at the University of Alabama. And there it was just, when I think about it, was just it was a very small group. And I mean, as you know, and most people know, material science is, tends to be smaller of the engineering departments at most universities. And it was no different there, but it was a very small and close knit group. We had really excellent professors. And they, very good teaching, but also at Alabama, the focus was really in metallurgy. So there it is still metallurgical engineering. So it is not like a true, I guess, material science program. So a lot of the things that you're taught is really focused around metals. And I think, now they've definitely changed that. But when I was a student, a lot of the courses that you took were all about metals. Which was right, which was really what I wanted to do. So I could have went to, Auburn University or a different university, but I really wanted to focus in metals. And one of the things I enjoyed about being a student in that department is that they were really active in professional societies and really encouraged undergraduate students to participate, be active participants in professional societies. And that really helped me increase my network, but also, being a 20-year-old, 19-year-old going to TMS, which is the Metals and Materials Society conference, you really start to see like how the little, I guess, not the small research that you're doing fits into the big picture, but also like who's leading the field in your area. And it helps you make connections and think about graduate school. Okay, these are, I want to step outside of my comfort zone. I want to step outside of the things that I'm doing. And here are the people who are doing these specific things at other institutions. So that's one of the things I really enjoyed about the materials education at Alabama, was that there was a big focus on building network and community.
That's very cool. We've talked a lot about professional societies on the podcast, so it's really great to hear, your example of how much that made a difference to you. That's really cool. Was that what drove you to want to be in academia or as well? I guess once you gave up on being Secretary of State, how did you decide on your backup career path?
Yeah, man, Secretary of State would have been really cool. But I think, when I started at Michigan, I chose John Allison as a PhD advisor because I did not want to go to academia. And if somebody would have told me, 6 years ago that I would be doing this, I would tell them that they were crazy and they were out of their mind. First of all, I saw how hard they worked, right? It's tough. And how little pay they got for such hard work. So I wanted to be as far from academia as possible. I was like, I'm going to go to industry, make a lot of money. That was the goal. And it wasn't until my third year of graduate school that I really started to think about academia. And that really came off of just really thinking about what I was going to do with the degree when it was over, and not really being sure like what my path was going to be. What was I really passionate about? There's of course, if you're in a PhD program, especially at a school like Michigan, you're smart. You could do whatever you want to do at the end of the day, but it's like, are you passionate about those things? And that's what was confusing for me at the time. Was I really passionate about it? And when I really sat down and thought about it, there were three things really driving me. I loved service, not just in advancing technical knowledge, but just serving people. So using those things, how are we really helping people outside of just gathering these very these results that we're getting? And another thing, I don't like to be told what to do. So I don't think I would have done really well in industry. But in my third year, especially when I started to get involved in projects like the project that we had in Liberia, I was like, these are the things that I'm passionate about outside of research, and there's only going to be really one position that's going to allow me to do all of the things that I'm passionate about. So research, the service, and the education, and that's really academia. And it wasn't until probably the end of the third year, that I decided that I would choose academia. And I remember John being, extremely like excited too, because of course most of his students go to industry and wanted to go to industry. So I think it was a new fun experience for both of us, kind of being on that
That's
path.
really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about what you did with the Liberia project?
Yeah. So at the time, when I was a student at Michigan, the University of Michigan had a grant through USAID, and the grant was really focused on development in Liberia. So not just necessarily education, development from different aspects. They had funding that was supposed to go to female engineering students, but towards the middle end of the grant, they realized they hadn't really did anything with female engineering students at Liberia. So, in the U.S., there's definitely women are still underrepresented in science in engineering. You go to a place like Liberia, and it's
Yeah.
even worse than you can imagine. So if you're thinking of 100 students, two are women. So they're, still they're in sexual intimidation. Don't have the laws and policies that protect women from these things there. So women face just some of the stories are crazy what they have to deal with from professors, from students, from administration, because it's still a very male dominated society. So how we can look at the dean's office and see people from different backgrounds, race, gender, anything. That's not the case there. It's still very male dominated. And they hadn't really did anything. And when we talked to some of the female students, one of the things that they felt they were missing was sense of community, right? So small numbers, not really anything, no organization that was really focused around the issues facing women in engineering there. So we decided that we would start this residential camp. So when I say we, Graduate Society of Women Engineers at Michigan, decided that we would start this camp for female engineering students, this 2-week residential camp. But on top of that, we would try to found a Society of Women Engineers chapter in Liberia, which we did both. And the camp has been going on since 2013, still goes on today, and it's very successful. So it's about anywhere between 60 and 70 engineering students, female engineering students within the country of Liberia. So usually there's 3 or 4 universities that participate. And then it's the team from the University of Michigan who, is really handling the camp. And so it's kind of twofold. So cross-cultural partnerships, but then also professional development for the students. So something that they cannot necessarily get at their home institution. So for us, if we want someone to help us with a resume, with a personal statement for a graduate school, it's very easy at U.S. institutions. But in places like that, it's not. And providing them with the tools and resources to do those things. And we have been very successful. So we've had numerous students graduate from institutions, including Michigan, for graduate degrees in the U.S. that have, gotten jobs in the U.S., Europe, China, you name it, we've had students to go on to be very successful. So the camp has really been transformational, not just for the Liberian students, but for the Michigan students as
Wow,
well.
that's fascinating.
Mhm.
Are you still involved in that at all? Is it over? Is a program over?
No, the program is not over. It's still, during the COVID years, it was more kind of one of the things we tried. I should step back. One of the things we tried to do over the years was um, by creating ELSWE was making them more independent. So not needing to have us in order to do things. And that has been what's been really successful. So they have their own programming that they do with K through 12 students. They do with students at their institution. So, they run completely independently. And now that COVID is over, the camp will go back to its
Mhm.
residential state.
That's really wonderful, the aspect of equipping these programs to sustain themselves, right? To keep going internally with their own structure, with their own resources.
And that's the point. I think when one of the things I've learned um, through a lot of outreach and education is that you want to empower people to be independent, right? That is the only way they can sustain, whether it's their way of life or their socioeconomic status. They have to have the resources and tools to be independent outside of wherever the governing organization or institution is. For the Liberian students, I can go there every year, but I'm not on the ground. I didn't grow up there. So they understand the issues that are facing young female students that are interested in science and engineering. What I mean by young is the K through 12 system. They understand it a lot better than me, right? That's just not going to be my background. And so by empowering them to have the tools, then they can, take that understanding and apply that in their own local environment. And that's really when I think about outreach and education, it's not telling somebody this is what I think you should know. It's saying, hey, what is lacking here? What are the gaps here? And how can I be of service?
Yeah, continuing on that the service theme, in addition to the work that you've done abroad, you've also done a lot sort of at home, in professional societies here in the States. And I know you've put in a lot of effort in TMS in particular in, helping to bring in more underrepresented, more underserved communities in material science and engineering. So what's currently going on in that area in professional societies in the US?
Yeah, I think TMS, over the years, especially since I entered, you know, in full transparency, when I went as an undergraduate student, I didn't see many people who look like me, almost no one who looks like me. And I feel like as the years have went on, I'm like, oh, I can count. I need more than one hand to count, right? And it shows the efforts, so the DEI efforts within the organization that they do work, right? And a lot of it is educating the society, not necessarily. I think a lot of people think that there are not people from diverse backgrounds that are doing material science work. And that's not the case. There are people from diverse backgrounds that are doing this type of work. They just haven't been invited, right? They haven't been invited to participate in what is second nature to other people, right? They don't, or there's not a funding structure at their institution that provides travel to conferences, right? So if you look at smaller schools, they tend to have more of the diverse groups. And so maybe there's not a funding structure to bring, to come to a conference. And when they're at the conference, right, are you including them? Do they feel included in the environment? And I think that last part is what TMS is shining in right now, is being inclusive. So if I show up, by myself, not from the University of Michigan, and I show up to TMS and I don't know anybody and there's really no avenue to include me where I can meet people, then I'm just another person going to the conference, and more than likely I won't come back again. Right? That feeling of isolation. We all want to feel. We want to belong. Right? There's a sense of belonging for most people, and when you have, whether it's a mixer, whether it's having people don't understand the importance of things like the DEI committee. Well, if you're walking into an institution and no one looks like you, that is a welcoming and safe environment for most people. They'll say, I'll go to this meeting because I'm probably going to meet people who are from diverse backgrounds, but also include, are creating equitable and inclusive spaces. So I think TMS is really shining in that inclusivity part. I think, the equity part, that is something where I think they are really starting to get into. So this mentorship program that they're rolling out, that matters because I had no idea up until I had been a member of TMS for over a decade. I had no idea how you got to the board of directors. No idea the path to that, right? No one at the time, Professor Michelle Manuel at Florida was the first and at that time the only Black woman that was on the board. And so there are not a lot of people to reach back and pull and say, hey, how do you get to the board? I didn't know any of those people on the board. They didn't feel accessible to me, right? Nothing about them felt accessible outside of Michelle, and that's because I know her. But I think when you have these organizations like mentorship programs that where people can partner with someone that says, hey, if you want to be on the board or you want to lead a technical symposium, this is how you do it. You don't have to be, in some, I guess, mafia to do it. Anybody can do it, but this is how you do it. And though that is the part where I think they're really, starting to come into and put more efforts in how do we make sure that everyone knows that they have access to the same resources, that they can put on a symposium, propose a symposium just like anybody else. It doesn't matter. And that's the part where I think they're really starting to make a difference. And when people feel included, it makes a better society for everyone because we all come from different backgrounds. We all have different perspectives. And, what we may think is cutting edge, you're going to think something very different is cutting edge. And so we have symposiums that support that. I think it's better for the entire society and field.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good advice in there. And the point that you made about that it's important to invite people to actively say, I want you to participate, but that's not enough. The fact that, okay, I invited you, you showed up, now what? If you're not addressing that now what question also, you
Right.
may not actually be helping people. And
Yeah, I agree.
with these mentoring opportunities that exist now, is this also something that's influenced how, as you're building a research program, right, as a faculty member, how is this influencing or driving how you interact with your own students and how you're mentoring graduate students now?
Right. I try to keep a very open door policy. And so, what I do with my students is at the beginning of their tenure with me, I have this entire document. And not only it talks about research goals and objectives, it talks about expectations, but it also talks about just general, how do you like to communicate? What is your management style? Do you prefer to be micromanaged? Do you, more hands-off approach? A little bit of both, all of those things so that to get to know each other. What are your career goals? And when I know my students' career goals, then I can start, helping them, increase their network or meet the right people so that when they leave here, they're well prepared. I think another thing I do that a lot of professors don't do is my students can give me at the end of the year, we go over that document, but I also ask them, well, what went right and what went wrong? What can I do better? You can be honest. If I did something that, you didn't like or it doesn't work for you, because at the end of the day, we all know ourselves. I come from both of my parents are tough love people. That's just how they are. And so by nature, I am a tough love type of person. A lot of people don't respond well to that. So when I know my students, actually, I don't respond well to tough love, Dr. Leonard, then that means that I can't take that approach with them. Because at the end of the day, I never want a student to look at me as a barrier, right, to getting their degree or whatever the case may be. So I'm very open and honest. What did I do that didn't work? And what did I do that you did like? And how can we, what can I do differently? How can I help you? How can I assist you? And the students tend to like that. They are usually very open and honest and they'll tell me the truth. And that's what I want. I want the truth so that I can be a better mentor to them, and so that they feel safe and comfortable with me as well. Um, and that's just something that I take very seriously because I think not every PhD advisor is a good mentor. And I don't think that's the way it should be. I think if, you're taking on a student for 5+ years, you should want to mentor that student, through whatever goals they have, right? And I think a lot of that is, being honest and in creating full transparency between you and the student, where I don't look at my students as I'm over them. To me, we're equals, right? I don't want them to be afraid of me or think, that I'm some genius or whatever the case may be, that they feel very comfortable and open with me, because I have a niece that's their age, right? So really making sure that, there's open lines of communications on both ends. Another thing I like to do in my group is I have these things called self-care days. It's where a student can just say, Dr. Lynn, I'm taking a self-care day. they don't have to, they don't owe me any explanation. I don't ask anything. I say, okay. And a lot of it is because, they have things that are going on in their life outside of graduate school. And I don't want my student to, be so stressed that it starts to affect them. I want them to feel, at peace. And a lot of times graduate school can be very stressful. And I think we have to acknowledge that there's a mental health piece to it. And we want to make sure that students are taking care of their mental health the same way I want them to take care of anything else. And so I do these self-care days, and students take them, and it's fine. And, I haven't had what people would say, oh, well, they'll abuse the system. I've never had a student, abuse that. But I think it definitely, helps the student feel safe and
Yeah, and it's really
understood.
treating them like a professional, right? You have a job, you get sick
Right.
days, you get vacation days. Sometimes you're like, I'm not going to work today. So affording them the same courtesy just seems reasonable when you put it that way.
Yes.
Oh, wonderful.
So when we were trying to come up with our list of topics to talk to you, I went to your website and I saw your blog, The Aerial Views, and I was blown away at how amazing that was. What struck me is just how very open and honest you are with the whole community that you're trying to help. Can you talk about what motivated you to build that website? Maybe talk about why you keep doing it.
Yeah, so the reason why I do it is when I was in graduate school, I showed up to Michigan and I was in a very old group. Like I was a first year, most of everyone was third and fourth years. And I just felt like I sucked at everything. I was comparing myself to them. They had mastered the skills that I was just trying, just learning to do. And I remember just being, man, like they are so smart. I'm never going to catch up to them. I'm never going to be at this place. I should just quit. And I remember expressing that to an older graduate student, and they laughed and said, hey, no, this is where we are now, but this is not where we started. And in that moment, I realized that we're all starting at the same place. And a lot of times we think that when we look at people, we think, oh, they're a genius and there's just something, very different about them. And it's something must be wrong with me, but I don't know their background. And when I learned their background, that they started just like me, it eased me. And so a lot of the reason, the motivation of the blog is really so that people know that, yeah, I may be this assistant professor at Ohio State now, but that is not where I
Right.
started, right? And that I went through the same struggles and obstacles as you did, right? And I just, it's the sense of not feeling alone, right? I think I always say when we talk about imposter syndrome, we talk about the person, but I always feel like the system gives people imposter syndrome. That's always in my thought. And a lot of it by the blog is saying, you're not an imposter, right? Like I struggle like big time, right? I've had ups and downs. There's my real life that's happening outside of graduate school. I've dealt with depression. I've dealt with these things too. And this is how I overcome it. This is, or how I overcame it. Or these are the things that I'm doing now. And I think that really motivated me to start the blog so that people didn't feel alone. I keep doing it because as I go on, people will tell me, oh, I read this article and it really helped me. I used it on my interview. And I'm like, oh, people actually read this and it's actually helping them. So I keep doing it. And a lot of it is like, I remember when I was negotiating a startup, I had no idea what I was doing or how to even start. Like, I had no idea. And if it wasn't for mentors that I had, I wouldn't have even been able to do it, right? It was my mentors that said, no, this is how you structure it. These are the things that you should ask for. And even in my time at OSU, I really learned, which is sad, is that so many people do not have good mentorship. And they make a lot of mistakes in the interview process and the startup negotiating process. There's a lot of mistakes made just because they do not know what to do or what to ask for. And so a lot of the blog is reaching the people who don't have access to that information. I would have never thought. I have a friend that asked for a down payment, so I would have never asked for a housing down payment in a startup. But as you're talking to people, you go, oh, well, people are asking for so many different things. And for a lot of people, things like that could be a big deciding factor for choosing a job, right? Or going to a certain location if you can't afford or you don't have the generational wealth to afford a house, any of those things. So, letting people know, like, people are asking for these things, not sure if it's going to work for you, but you can, or just being completely lost in the interview process, just giving people things to think about as they are on their professional journey. And that's what really motivates me. It's really the people that tell me that the blog helps them. And honestly, as you were saying, a lot of it is open and transparent. And I think, again, it goes back to that. I know for most people, we want to feel like we belong to something. We want to feel like someone is hearing us, someone understands us. And that's really what the blog is about, so that people understand that you're looking at me now, but you saw me at 18 or when I first got to Michigan, it was a very different environment for me, right? And that's just honestly, I was coming from, a small town in Alabama. I was a big fish in my small pond. And then I came to Michigan and there were a lot of big fishes. And that takes, you go, oh, okay, I'm in, as they say in The Wizard of Oz, I'm not in Kansas anymore, right? And it's not that I wasn't smart as everybody else. I just had to get used to a different environment, and letting people know that you can do that and you can survive it and you will be better for it is really what keeps me doing the blog.
Well, I just want to thank you for doing it, because I think it's amazing. And, you're right. We're all suffering from imposter syndrome. There's nobody who hasn't felt that way many, many times in their career. Now Tim and I are doing podcasts. What do we know about this?
Zero. We are building the ship as we fly it.
Right. There's that great movie I think came out of Stanford. I don't know if I'm not out of Caltech. A PhD is not enough. Have you ever seen that?
Oh,
it's incredible. It's done like a Hollywood movie, because they're in Hollywood. And it's all about how it's written by graduate students, and it's all about how they all suffer through imposter syndrome, every single one of them, and how they all learn how to overcome it with a lot of help, mostly from other graduate students, because the faculty are pretty useless. But it's a very funny movie, and I think it only costs $5.
No, I need to check it out. And I think you make a point too of how, again, creating the blog is that it's other graduate students that really help other graduate students, especially the younger ones, because they've, very recently lived the experience in the same time. I think a lot of times for PIs, especially if they're older, they came up in a very different time in the world, and just things that were acceptable or not understood. We know now we do better. And so I think, the current graduate students can have a huge influence. And that's why I think it's also important within graduate programs that graduate students have community, right? That there is an organization and that the department supports graduate students building community, because the graduate experience is very different than the undergraduate experience, right? And you're bringing students from very different places around the world to, the same program. And every student is going to have very different needs, and some of them are going to have very similar needs. And I think that, the graduate students, that peer mentorship is so important in graduate school. And I think sometimes that's overlooked, where people may think, oh, well, they're graduate students, they haven't figured out, or they're too busy. But peer mentorship is extremely important, I think, on the graduate school level.
Yeah, I think it's important in the undergraduate level as well. And I'm very proud of our undergrads because they have a really strong group with the Michigan Materials Society.
Yep.
And it's really different than a lot of other departments right here at the same College of Engineering. Our undergrads don't compete with each other, and they're proud of it. They're proud of it. They help each other. They even help each other get jobs. And so we're trying to use that to actually convince other students to come to our department. But we also have a very strong GSC that you're probably aware of, and that creates the graduate student community. And it's very important for our department to support both of those organizations because that's the glue that really makes us a special place. And so and you contributed a lot to that when you were here, and I thank you for that. And it's continuing. So your legacy lives.
Yeah, and I think that's, it's just I remember when we would have the chili cornbread cook-off. For some people, it seems like, but it really was a way to pull everyone out of the lab, talk to each other, what's going on in your lab, what's happening, and just really checking in with each other to make sure that, we weren't leaving anyone behind.
Right.
And that can happen in grad school because I feel like we're isolated. We're in our, our little labs and we're doing our experiments. Especially when you're out of classes, if you don't want to see someone, you do not have to see them. And I think those, events really, help us check in with each other and make sure that, like I said, no one's being left behind.
Yeah, there's a really important synergy between community building and peer mentoring that I think we as a community need to explore more and really understand that how we can get better mentorship opportunities by building these community social experiences and using those as kind of a catalyst to drive mentoring interactions. Brief story moment before we get back to the official script. So just last week, I had a student email me and say, hey, can I get an override to sign up for your class, my junior level lab class? And I'm like, sure. Because this particular student hadn't taken the intro course yet. She was planning to take both of them at the same time, which is possible if you're motivated to do so. And I said, okay, I'll give you an override, but you have to talk to my student who just completed my course, who was in the same position as you a year ago, because that particular person who just went through your experience is exactly the right person to give you the advice that you actually need. Not me, but to your point, Aeriel, the student who just lived through that a year ago, that's who you need to talk to. And so I hope that we can do more of that kind of matchmaking from our position of saying, let me connect you with someone in your peer group who really is the person that you need to talk with right now.
Yeah, I agree.
So what courses are you teaching?
So I teach a senior undergraduate course in the fall, fatigue and fracture. And then in the spring, I teach the graduate level mechanical behavior of materials class. And I've taught them since I started.
Do you feel you were prepared for teaching, or did you just get thrown in the pit and say, do it?
I was not prepared in any way. And I think that's, something that I think, graduate. When I was a student, I took one course from Dr. Susan Montgomery, who I heard is retired. She taught a course on teaching engineering for grad students, that were interested in academia. And it was really, really helpful. But I wish there was more of that. Because I remember when I started at OSU January of 2021, which was in the middle of COVID. And I taught that first semester virtually, and I had no idea what I was doing. It's just being honest, no idea what I was doing. And if it wasn't, I think at the time, Ahmed Misra was teaching it there. So I reached out to him and said, hey, do you have any, old notes that I can use? And, he provided me with the notes that he used, and I gathered some from other professors. And one thing I learned I love the objectives and the topics in mechanical behavior of materials, but I always felt the way it was taught to me was not helpful in research. And a lot of it is because it focuses to me more on mechanics of materials, teaching you stress, strain, tensor. To be honest, you can use a computer program to determine any of that, right? So what I liked about Amit's class is that it was coming from the perspective of dislocations, which I thought is really what's important when we're describing mechanical behavior. So I mixed a little bit of the things that he was doing with the, things that I had learned, the way I was taught. And I think it's been very helpful for the students because that is what drives behavior. And teaching them about tools that they can use to really understand that behavior has been helpful. But no, I was not, to go back to your initial question, I didn't feel prepared for my graduate education. And looking back on it, if I would have known earlier on that I wanted to choose academia, I could have taken courses in the College of Education. And hindsight is 2020. I would have, if I could go back, I probably would have did it. But what I do like here at Ohio State is that we do have the Drake Center for Teaching and Learning. Similar to most institutions, there is a center that focuses on teaching and learning, and you can get assistance, and it's very helpful. They, consider your class. They can show you ways to, innovative teaching solutions. And so that's been very helpful, I think, for a young faculty member is really learning like how to teach and what is the best way to teach.
Well, of course, that's one of the reasons why Tim and I are doing this podcast. This started in the education committee at TMS, and they wanted me to write an article for JOM about what I'm doing in my classroom. And I'm like, I don't want to write that in JOM. And I said, how about if we do a podcast? And so we've been having a lot of fun, but the whole point of our podcast is to try to share best practices for teaching different topics in material science, different pedagogical approaches, to discuss it. And that's kind of also the theme of our NAMES conference, the North American Materials Education Symposium. That's, shameless plug, coming up in Ann Arbor this summer, August 7th and 8th. And it's a place where it's not like ASCE where people are writing papers on education research. That's, there might be a few people who want to talk about that at our conference, and that's fine. But the overwhelming number of talks are just regular faculty members who do research, who are also teaching, who really get passionate about how they're approaching teaching and how they can help their students become more knowledgeable about material science. So hopefully you'll come to that. Hopefully you'll contribute to it. But it's really a lot of fun to talk to other materials people about how they teach materials. And it's a very welcoming and sharing community. Mm-hmm. So I love that group of people. It's great.
I think, too, I was just at a conference in Maryland, and I met a professor at Chapel Hill that's in biology. And she was, so she started a class there, and it was basically a class to develop social-based research in biology. And the projects are developed by undergraduate students, and it's basically how to teach biology. And these undergraduate students were doing some very interesting things, even getting papers published in education journals about the best practices for teaching, even a project on what is there advantage of using cheat sheets? Do they actually help students when they're taking an exam, or, is it really no difference? And all of those things are things I never had thought about. You give a student, you think, oh, I'm helping them, because they can make a cheat sheet, but am I really helping them? Are they just relying on the cheat sheet? Are they really learning how to study, and things of that nature? And so I think conferences like the NAMES conference that you were discussing is very important because, especially for a new faculty member, it can be very overwhelming when everyone's throwing out all these different teaching ideas. This is how I taught it. This is what I do. And sometimes, finding your own rhythm can be very difficult. So I think these conferences can be helpful because you can, learn how other people may be teaching the same material that you're teaching in a very different way. So I'm excited about it.
Of course, the best part, the talks aren't as good as all the conversations in the hallways where you can actually interact with people one-on-one, and that's probably the best part.
As long as we're talking about good intentions here, because there is that sort of, I'm doing these things that I believe help the students, but it's hard to step back and ask, am I actually helping them, right? Even what evidence do I have that I am improving things for my students? That can be a hard thing to grapple with when you're truly doing your best in a genuine way, but to ask, could I be doing something differently or better? That's just something always on my mind. Connecting that to the being prepared to teach question. None of us is ever really prepared to teach, but we walk in and we do it anyway. May I humbly suggest that would be a great blog post for Aeriel Views to say, so you think you might be teaching, now what? Because you can't be prepared, but you can certainly try to prepare yourself. So I don't know, are there any thoughts that you might toss out there real quick for anyone in the audience who's saying, I might go into a teaching career? What are a couple quick tips you have to share?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is being very clear on your syllabus, what the objectives. One of the things I learned, what are the objectives for the class? Not only it keeps me honest, but it also helps any student that's thinking about taking your class or taking your class really understand what information are they going to get out of the class. For me, I teach mostly senior level graduate students or senior level undergraduate students or graduate students. And so for graduate students, it's more about how does this help me in my research? For undergraduate students, a lot of the times if they're taking fatigue and fracture, it's because they want to go into a career that's either failure analysis or deals with mechanical behavior properties of materials. And so making sure that they understand what are the things that are going to be necessary in the real world. So something that I've started doing, especially my fatigue and fracture course, because it's really more applied, is I have a lot of friends that work in the failure analysis space or work in mechanics of materials. And I've been asking them, when you hire an entry-level student or position for an entry-level position, what are some of the things you want them to know? What are some of the things you want them to understand? And, they will tell me, this is what I would like for them to know, or this is what I'm noticing, in students that are graduating. They can't read a spec. They can't read a spec and tell me what's happening. They don't understand tolerances, like very, very things that we think are intuitive, right? Of course, you know what a tolerance is on a pencil bar. You've used an ASTM standard. And what I've learned is actually they haven't. And so, really asking the people who are going to be hiring these students, what is useful for them to know and making sure that I'm incorporating that in my curriculum. For graduate students, something that I like to do before the course starts is I have a pre-survey. And a lot of it is, what is your research area? What are some of the things what are some of your goals for taking this course? Do you feel like there's an area that you want to know more about that you don't know? So they throw out something like, I'm really interested in corrosion fatigue. Well, my response is always, well, this is a mechanical behavior materials course, but, we have an excellent corrosion center here for people who teach corrosion fatigue, that talk about it for 12 weeks. Maybe you should consider taking that class instead. So it's really making sure that that everyone is well aligned. But also, if I see that I have a lot of students taking my class that are working in composites, and that may not have been, what was popular the year before, I try to make sure that I include, more information about mechanical behavior and composites. So, I don't want to say like, this is what I'm teaching, so take it or leave it, but really making sure I incorporate the students' goals into my curriculum.
That's really great. And that's something that I imagine becomes more productive as you work with students who are further along in their education and who are kind of getting ready for a career where they can actually have a best guess about, here's what's going to be useful for me in the future. Because if I'm teaching a freshman, like, I can ask them that question, but I may not get a very meaningful responses all the time.
Right. And I think that's the difference too, is like teaching, for me, like I said, I teach upper level undergraduates, and I know for majority of them before the class, with their pre-survey, that they're all interested in a career in this area. And for graduate students, most of the time they're doing research in mechanical behavior. The first time you teach a course, it's not the
Right.
You learn these things after you teach it the first The first time is, I feel like the first time I taught, I stayed within the lines. I was like, okay, this is what, the people before me have taught. And then I'm like halfway through it, I'm like, this is not fun for me. So I know it's not fun for the students. So I did it like an entire like middle of, semester revamp. But another thing that I do, again, Tim, because I don't mind constructive criticism, I will ask students individually, like, how is it going for you, and ask them to be honest. Like my students just took my final yesterday. I emailed 5 students just randomly and say, hey, how was the final, and every student was honest and gave very good feedback, and it helps me when I think about next semester. What are some of the things I can do differently? I don't, like, again, for me, I don't want students to look at any of my courses as a barrier or something that they need to be stressed about. I want you to do well, and I'm going to teach you that you have to learn the things that you need to know, so that's not going to change. But are there things that I could be doing differently to help you get to that point?
Yeah, finding that balance can be very challenging, of having some things in the class that aren't negotiable. We are experts in some ways, and to say everyone is going to have to do X, but to still build that into a framework of, and my goal is to help you succeed at that, so tell me how I can help you succeed better. Yeah, that's the art.
So I don't want to forget one very important thing. I want to let you talk a little bit about what you're doing with research and your research group. And I also, when you tell us a little bit about that, have you been allowed to teach a specialty course focused on your graduate students? That's usually a really fun kind of course to teach.
Yeah, so my research group really focuses on deformation-induced mechanisms. So a lot of the things that we look at is what interactions within the microstructures. Mostly we work with structural metals, so dislocation interactions within the microstructure influence crack initiation during fatigue. And once you have a crack that's initiated, how does the local environment change how that crack grows, right? So really understanding that accumulation of plasticity, and then how once you have that accumulation and have a void or crack that's nucleated, how does the surrounding plasticity around that growing crack influence its growth? To really understand that, we use a lot of in situ techniques. So whether it be in the SEM scanning electron microscope, transmission electron microscope, or high energy diffraction microscopy using synchrotron sources, we really seek to understand deformation and microstructural evolution. And that can be things like outside of fatigue and fracture, but also things like recrystallization and grain growth, right? So how does local environments within the microstructure influence evolution when we think about evolution of grain behavior, especially when we think about this industry 4.0, different manufacturing or new manufacturing techniques. So that's a lot of what we do in my group. As far as classes, so as you know, Steve, I'm on the tenure track. So have not gotten to the point to invent a new class. But because a lot of my research is in fatigue and fracture mechanical behavior of materials, the courses that I teach definitely are in my research area. And they actually, the point to what you're making, they make it's a lot more fun, especially my undergraduate course, because the students, they're graduating and they're really interested in a career in this area. And so it's really fun teaching them because they ask very good questions and thoughtful questions. We talk about, real failures. They bring failures to me that they've learned about, and it makes the class a lot more fun. Because for a lot of them, they're super excited about the topic because they either have a job in it or getting a job, looking for a job in it. And it happens that my course occurs at the same time as the failure analysis course. So a lot of the things I talk about, they actually see it in the lab in that course. And the instructor and I actually that teaches failure analysis, we sit right beside each other. So there's a lot of correlation between those courses, and that course is a lot of fun. Because of that, and because I do the research in the area, it's very easy to talk about, when I'm teaching. So it's a lot of fun. Something I started doing in my undergraduate course is, I'm not sure if you guys have heard of the game called Buffalo. Heard of
No.
Buffalo? So it's actually a game that was created from an NSF grant. The grant was initially given to this company to combat implicit bias in science and engineering, specifically for women. And the game just grew, and now they have different decks, LGBTQ plus, so many different decks. But it's like a matching game, and you have to think of a person. So like it could be like Native American astrologist, and you have to name a person. And whoever is the quickest gets the most cards, and they win. And sometimes you can get stuck. What it teaches the students is kind of about identity. And what you learn is that a lot of students only know things in their local environment. You know, once they have to step, it could be like Vietnamese Oscar winner. It could be any of those things. Once they step outside of that local environment, they have no clue about anybody else. And so it kind of teaches them, you know, to kind of be more open to learning about different cultures and different groups of people. And a lot of it is for a lot of these students, they're going into the real world to work. And everyone's not going to look like them, and everyone's not going to have the same background as them. So making sure that you're open to different groups of people and understanding, is there an implicit bias that I have? You know, like for me, if you ask me to name, I'm not really big on basketball. I don't like it. So if you ask me to name a basketball player, I can't do it. I'm completely shut off to basketball. I don't like the sport at all. I'm a big football person, but I don't like basketball. So if I'm asked a question about it, I can't answer it. And a lot of it is because I've completely shut myself off about that. And so what that does is it makes me ignorant in a subject, right? Because I've completely said I don't like it and I don't want to get to know it. That's a very simple example, but those examples can become more complex, and it can really hinder your growth as a person. So when you're working on teams of diverse groups in a setting, then you may have some issues, if you don't become more open. So I play that game at the beginning of that's actually the first class in my fatigue and fracture course. Our first lecture is playing Buffalo.
Sounds excellent. I really like to try that with one of my classes now. It just sounds like a great experience.
Is it called that because everybody gets buffaloed pretty quickly?
Yes. Eventually they get stuck. And what I've learned that usually there's some things that come out of it too. When you have a international student sitting in a group of domestic students, the international students will have an answer, but they will not say it because their thought is, well, these students didn't grow up, watching this cartoon, so they're not going to know this person is, so I'm not just going to say it, even though that's not the instructions.
Yeah.
The instructions, you can name anything. It doesn't matter whether you think we believe you or not. And so they usually hold back. And usually the students who are the best at the game are students who are the best at trivia, because if you like trivia, it forces you to learn about different things, and they tend to win. So yeah, it's a good game. So much comes out of it.
You'll have to help us find the link to it so we can put it in the show notes for others to try it.
I will.
Well, I think that brought together a lot of the themes that we talked about today in one very surprising conclusion. So I guess before we wrap it up and call it a day, are there any last topics that you wanted to make a pitch for, or any shameless self-promotion you want to engage in? If you have a message for the audience, the floor is yours.
Nothing like we already talked about the blog. So I'm always, telling people to give me feedback, or if there are topics that, you want to know more about, or you want me to talk about, or a question that you want to ask me. I'm always, open to answering, open to writing, giving me ideas for different blog posts, because a lot of it I just write when I get the feeling to write it. But if there are specific topics that people are interested in, they can always message me on my blog.
Excellent. Well, thank you once again for joining us today. It's been a great conversation, and we're already at an hour, so I should stop talking.
Yeah, thank you very, very much.
Excellent.
No, thank you guys
for
having me.
And to the audience out there, as always, we'll see you next time on the next episode of Undercooled.